Although I generally steer clear of most of the rumour mill, and in the last week we've had a range of Switch successor dates mooted, there does seem to be very strong circumstantial evidence between leaks and Chinese accessories going on sale that the new system is likely sooner rather than later. This much smoke would make it surprising if the next system were a November or even September release, and while in my previous video I mused on the proposition of a highly expedited release, in this video I want to look at some logistics of the central course of a release in summer of 2025. I had suggested previously that while a 4 to 5 month or so window from reveal to release would be standard for past home consoles, and that while there is indeed a logic in trying for a release sooner than that, I thought March would be extremely unlikely. April going into Golden Week felt like a better stretch for all sorts of logistical reasons, as covered in my prior video. However, while there are certain benefits to a curtailed reveal to release window, particularly in terms of advertising approaches, Nintendo seems already to be experiencing the challenges of keeping a lid on leaks, and that challenge will only escalate the longer they wait. Now, leaks in themselves might not be too crucial to the company at this point. With an iterative upgrade on the current concept, they don't have to explain so much, and they might just be able to get away with something closer to the 10 or so weeks the Switch Lite and Switch OLED got as a lead. Still, assuming the system skips the April window, we're looking at summer, and in this eventuality there is quite a lot that we can nail down. June in particular has a storied history for Nintendo consoles. The Super Game Boy released on the 14th of June 1994, the N64 on the 23rd of June 1996, and the new 2DS XL released on the 15th of June 2017. Nintendo has in the past released consoles in July even, the Game Boy Light on the 21st of July 1996, the 3DS XL on the 28th of July 2012, and of course the original Famicom on the 15th of July 1983. However, I think we can rule out July almost certainly. In these days when Nintendo is issuing a global release, putting out a premiere product in the middle of the summer holiday period would be hugely problematic. Their ad campaigns would have to compete with good weather, and while that sort of works in Japan, where the humid, sweltering weather can make air-conditioned gameplay a welcome reprieve from the summer heat, and might even work for smaller consoles such as the Lite, which are designed to be played on vacation, there's little reason to think that July would be a release window that suits a global market. While Nintendo usually does have a big July game as a jewel in the crown title, these are usually games that particularly appeal to the Japanese audiences. Pikmin 4, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and Splatoon 2 all being examples of the type. I think if they release in that quarter at all, they would rather wait for September. But at this point, I don't think they will. There's enough in the air around the spring quarter of next year that it feels at this point about 70% locked in. Here's the thing, I actually don't know that in Nintendo's original game plan, June was the date that they would be going for. Just objectively, if I were to pick a date off the calendar, I don't think June is especially auspicious compared to March or April, where they have the hype of Pokemon and Mario days, the end of the financial year, Golden Week, and a solid stretch of prime selling time to shift the initial Switch successor stock. The Game Boy, the 3DS, and Switch all launched earlier in the year, April, February, and March respectively, and while it's true that the N64 released in June, this was only after a delay. Early on, they hoped it would hit in the holiday 1995 season to go toe-to-toe with the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, and what a counterfactual that might have been. But in any event, it was delayed to the 21st of April, and yet they worried ultimately that they would not have enough stock for launch, going instead for a staggered release of the 23rd of June in Japan and the 29th of September in North America, with other territories not receiving the machine until the 1st of March 1997. It seems to me that Nintendo has a few key windows it sees as primed for console releases. We may never know whether, as reported last year, Nintendo ever did have designs for the successor console to launch in the holiday 2024 window, and while I may explore this in a separate video, the fact is that ever since May 2024, when Shuntaro Furukawa made his legendary announcement, they have been locked on a course which pretty much guarantees the machine would not debut before, at the very earliest, March. For it to be pushed back, there would have to be reasons which may include that software was not ready, or that they felt they could still continue to milk the Switch and didn't need to tip their hands just yet. It probably also included circumstances around the media landscape, and I've talked before about concerns they recount in their financial briefings around exchange rate difficulties. It always struck me as highly probable, given the disruption in Vietnam as well, following Typhoon Yagi, a devastating event which had severe humanitarian but also economic consequences for exports for months, that there would be some kind of adjustment. The indications are strong that many of these models are being manufactured in Vietnam, which has been experiencing bottlenecks and delays at ports over recent weeks as the country rebuilds its infrastructure. It's pure conjecture, of course, but it just feels to me that June is more of a backup date than a prime slot, but it may be the slot that Nintendo is choosing. However, that doesn't mean that the June window has nothing to recommend it, and they have used it before after all. Now, Golden Week runs until the 5th of May 2025, so I think the chances of a release in that window are almost certainly out. If you're going to have a big release, you do it before a significant sales window. The end of May is tricky too, with many countries having additional bank holidays during the latter half of May. Bank holidays aren't necessarily a problem for Nintendo, as if the shops are open, it's a chance for people to have the time to buy and play a new console. But equally, if it clashes with people taking time off or shop closures for religious or cultural reasons, that might not be ideal. Also, airspace is going to be fairly expensive around Golden Week as companies seek to push products which are actually coming into stores immediately. It makes sense, therefore, to start going into high gear with marketing at the beginning of May, and that leaves too short a window for a May release unless it's right at the end of May. Obviously, we've seen exceptions to this before. 12th of May was the date for Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but I suggest that this date was chosen to slipstream in right behind the Super Mario Bros. Movie as a major eye-catching Switch release, following right after that film's big debut. That game aside, it is very unusual for much of note to launch in May. June, on the other hand, has a clearer calendar. So the question then becomes, when in June? In my previous deep dive on Nintendo's dates, I established that Nintendo usually has a game release at the end of July on what is often week 29 of the year. I think we can assume that this will hold true next year as well. They also like to separate out their releases. In the holiday window, they sometimes go for 3-week gaps, and for smaller releases, even 2-week gaps. At other times of the year, 4 weeks or even longer is more standard. But it strikes me that in the early period of a new console's life, they will want to have a fairly solid drumbeat of new titles. A confounding factor could be the presence of classic Switch releases in the middle of the Switch 2's run. If they decide to release Switch 2 games with a roughly 4-weekly schedule, but then had original Switch titles dropping at the midpoint in this range, this would be a very dense array of titles, but would nevertheless give each title a little bit of airspace to itself. In 2017, Nintendo didn't seem to bother too much about overlapping 3DS and Switch release dates at first. In fact, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Fire Emblem Echoes were released on the same day. But later in the year, there were signs that the Switch games were being given a little more space, with Metroid Samus Returns on the 15th of September, Pokémon Tournament DX on the 22nd of September, Fire Emblem Warriors on the 28th, and then Mario and Luigi on the 5th of October. A lot of titles in quick succession, true, but a balance of 3DS and Switch releases at least, and subsequently there was no overlap between 3DS launch dates and Switch launch dates, though sometimes there was only a week separating them. I tend to think that Nintendo might want to give a bit more prestige to Switch titles than the old 3DS titles here, as unlike in the case of the 3DS, the Switch titles will be forward compatible with the new hardware, and so it just makes sense to give them a bigger blowout. This is where it would make most sense to have titles that play on the OG Switch just as well, but are significantly more impressive on the new hardware. Pokemon Legends ZA may be such a game. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond also feels very likely. Now, Nintendo might not want an initial run of games that are not Switch 2 exclusive, but I'm not sure this matters so much to them. After all, for many early adopters, just having the better quality means of playing the new games will be enough to guarantee a quick sale, and by the time units have sold to the most devoted fanbase, we'll be into September, and Nintendo will have a lot more scope to release both original Switch and successor Switch games as they choose. Let's assume then that Nintendo will stick to Thursday releases. After all, they transitioned to Friday on Wii U before the Switch launch, so the fact that they've been sticking quite strongly to Thursdays recently suggests that they'll stay the course for a while yet. That leaves the 24th of July as the likely last big title before high summer. If we could go back in 3-week intervals as is common, we get the 3rd of July and the 12th of June, which would make a perfect 1-2-3 set of releases. Launch title Metroid Prime 4 and Pokemon Legends ZA perhaps. Putting ZA in July solves the problem of having a big anchor game for the original Switch in the July to September quarter, and then they just need to have a Switch title before the new console's release in the April to June quarter, let's say a late April game, and then one more OG Switch title before July, which could be another cross-gen or could even be a smaller title. Remember, April to June is the time of year that Nintendo usually gives us some ultra-casual titles like Endless Ocean, Game Builder Garage, Everybody Want to Switch, Switch Sports, Clubhouse Games, and so on. An ultra-casual Switch title wouldn't be such a problem in terms of scheduling, since it's not going to be the kind of game that fans are bulk ordering on day one, but rather the kind of title that can expect a slow trickle of sales over the following months. It also wouldn't disrupt the advertising for any other game that they're advertising, because it's going to appeal fundamentally to a different market. If they placed such a game next to a Switch 2 title, well, it probably won't matter all that much if they're even on the same day, or at least in consecutive weeks. If we assume Nintendo do bigger than 3-week intervals though, we could imagine the launch date being the 5th of June or the 29th of May, but neither of those feels likely to me given the number of bank holidays around and the difficulty of coordinating such a major global release. 5th of June feels the more likely of the two, but the 12th of June feels like the sweet spot to me. Nintendo very rarely releases consoles in the first week of the month, although there is of course the shining exception in recent years of the Nintendo Switch. Still, the only game to release on Switch in the first 7 days of June is Clubhouse Games, which was mid-pandemic, and I would say the 12th of June is probably our favoured option here. If we assume, though, that they don't want to have two separate game drop windows after a launch, it could go a little bit further forward. The 26th of June would allow for a 4-week gap before the July game, and Nintendo may well want to leave some air here for big third-party releases, although in the past, even when they've published major first-party exclusives, they haven't really given them much consideration in their schedule. They dropped Captain Toad Treasure Tracker on the same day as Octopath Traveler, for example, even though that was a fairly prominent Switch-timed exclusive. They did give a fairly clear run to Monster Hunter Rise, but in that case, 1, it was during the pandemic, and 2, given the scale and importance of that game, especially in the Japanese market where some employers gave people time off to play the game, it was probably only wise. I can't see ports of even the most prestigious third-party titles commanding quite the same level of respect from Nintendo. Still, what if I'm wrong on my 3-weekly theory? Nintendo does have a track record after very major releases of waiting a while. There was a pause after Animal Crossing New Horizons, although that was mid-pandemic, and they had long gaps after Breath of the Wild and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, but this was during a time when the company was kind of running on fumes, although trying to mask it for the launch of the Switch. In most recent times, though, they have left 6 weeks clear after Pokemon Legends ZA and Switch Sports. I suspect there's a good logistical reason, which is that they want to let those games get the full measure of their public discussion and also want to clear their warehouse of the massive amounts of stock they will have accrued in advance of the game titles before restocking. In this case, if we assume Mario Kart is the launch game, a 5-week window, punctuated only by some tiny Switch footnote title, could be a sensible strategy. This would put us at the 19th of June as the likelier launch date. I guess my hesitation here is that this is a very different launch from the original Switch. The original Switch had to grow slowly because the company didn't have anything else up its sleeve at that point. The cupboards resembled a Mother Hubbard nursery rhyme in terms of new games, something that became all the more apparent by the time 2018 rolled round and the system subsisted on a primary diet of ports and Labo entries. Now though, Nintendo wants to show its shop window, the key kinds of titles you can expect from the new Switch. Pokemon is, well, Pokemon. Mario Kart also sells itself, but I think a core audience title like Metroid Prime 4 or even Astral Chain 2 or something completely different could be really critical here in terms of bringing on board a key set of early adopters, those very hardcore gamers who will indicate whether the system is an early success. There are good arguments that Metroid may not come until September or October. Metroid has had a huge track record of releases in this window in the past, and of course, if Pokemon Gen 10 isn't destined for November 2025, then the Pokemon Company may not want to give up that sweet pre-Thanksgiving release slot that they usually have their cap on, and could save Legend ZA for this specific date. With a Pokemon title shoring up the holiday quarter, plus Mario Kart already out, they would want a quieter title with a different audience for October. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond would suit this, and I'm struck by the similarity of Metroid Prime 4's trajectory in terms of reveal to release to Bayonetta 3's. Very early announcement, a long silence, a trailer the previous year, and then in Bayonetta's case, a holiday window release sandwiched between the major sellers of Splatoon 3 in September and Pokemon Gen 9 in November. Another option, of course, is that Nintendo do game releases in, say, 19th of June, 25th of July, and then come back earlier than usual after the summer and do a 28th of August game. This was the kind of slot Astral Chain launched in back in the day. It seems very likely to me as it gives a 3-week grace period before the 18th of September, which is the anniversary of Super Mario 3D All-Stars, but more pointedly, mid-September is the anniversary of Super Mario Bros. Itself, the 40th anniversary. And while 18th of September isn't a perfect match for the original game, I think Nintendo would like to keep September as their big anniversary date for Mario, and I think this has to be a lock for a Mario title and possibly even the new 3D Mario title. Mario Kart in June, 3D Mario in September, Pokemon in November. Well, this would mean the rest of their lineup is really just for showing off because those three are truly titanic titles. On balance, I still think the optimal date would be mid-April, but I also feel that while it has some advantages, the release to reveal window does feel a little too tight to me. 12th of June or 19th of June feel optimal, with the 12th of June feeling perhaps a little likelier, but obviously this is something that will continue to be assessed as we get closer to launch. It's quite possible that Nintendo themselves don't know for absolute sure even as we speak. Thanks everyone for watching, thanks as ever to my Patreon supporters, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.